Imagine, if you will, a wise old man who ruled as king over a great land. One day, having decided to visit a neighbouring kingdom, the old king leaves his land under the supervision of two of his eldest sons, planning to take his throne back upon his return. However, before his visit to the neighbouring kingdom is over, he learns that his sons have taken the throne for themselves and are refusing to return it to him again. The old king was Ethelwulf, king on the Anglo-Saxon throne of Wessex, and his two sons were Æthelbald and Ethelbert.
Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.
Practically nothing is known about the early lives of these two future kings. We know that their father had 6 children: Æthelstan, Æthelswith, Æthelbald, Ethelbert, Æthelred, and Alfred, probably all with their father's first recorded wife, Osburh. Æthelbald was his father's second son, and was probably born less than a decade before Ethelwulf had taken the throne. It is therefore likely that he would have met his grandfather Ecgbert, who was still king of Wessex while Ethelwulf ruled the sub-kingdom of Kent. Given his status as the second eldest son, he would likely have been prepared for the possibility of kingship, but without any real certainty that he would ever actually ascend to the monarchy. In 840, a year after Ecgbert's death and Ethelwulf's ascension, Æthelbald is acknowledged in Charter S 290 as Filius Regis, which meant the king's son. This was actually the very first time in which he is mentioned in any historical records, and it is interesting given that none of his other siblings are mentioned as being present. Æthelstan would by now have taken over his father's old role as the sub-king of Kent and heir to Wessex. However, neither Ethelbert, Ethelred, or Alfred are mentioned, implying that they had not been born yet. By 850 it seems that Æthelbald had finally come into his majority, as he is consistently referred to as a dux, which meant he was an ealdorman or noble in his own right. During these early years, Wessex, like most other regional kingdoms, had been badly battered by constant Viking attacks. However, Ethelwulf had been more successful than most at driving them back, and had managed to keep his borders fairly well secured. However, the Vikings would not allow the kingdom of Wessex to know peace so easily. In 850, the Vikings began a series of large attacks against Wessex. Ethelwulf's eldest son, Æthelstan, launched a fleet of warships to meet them on the seas, and the two fleets did battle off the Kentish coast near Sandwich. Æthelstan would prove victorious, but he would not be mentioned again afterwards, likely dying due to injuries he had sustained in the battle. This obviously had a profound effect on Æthelbald. Since Æthelstan had no children, his death moved Æthelbald up the line of succession and made him his father's heir to not only Kent, but Wessex itself. Yet Æthelbald would have had little time to consider his new position before further news hit. More Vikings had arrived, and they had already quickly moved to defeat the army of the Kingdom of Mercia before turning to take Wessex itself. Æthelwulf called Æthelbald to his side, and together they marched with their army to block the Viking advance at the strategically important location of Aclea. The main source for the battle, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, was written more than 30 years after the battle had ended, but it reports that it was the greatest battle against the Vikings in history, with more than 350 Viking crews present during the conflict. Ethelwulf and Æthelbald would ultimately win the battle, smashing their enemies and routing them from the field where they presumably fled Wessex. 3 years later, in 854, Æthelbald would be recorded signing another of his father's charters, along with his younger brother Æthelbert, marking the first time that he would appear in the annals of history. Both were addressed as dux in that charter, making it apparent that they were both considered grown men in at least the Anglo-Saxon definition of the word. By this time their mother Osburh had passed away, and the two youngest children, Ethelred and Alfred, had both been born. Interestingly, it seems that only their elder sister Ethelswith had actually married by this time. Their father Ethelwulf had arranged for her marriage to the king of Mercia to strengthen an alliance between the two kingdoms. The following year Ethelwulf would make the decision that would change his life forever. Unexpectedly, and seemingly without warning, Ethelwulf decided that he would make a personal trip to Rome with his two youngest sons. In his place he intended that his two eldest sons, Æthelbald and Ethelbert, would take over the running of his kingdom while he was away. Æthelbald would take control of the kingdom of Wessex, while Ethelbert would be given control of Kent. Up until then, Kent had been treated as a kingdom that the heir to the throne of Wessex would rule, serving as an opportunity for them to learn the ways of kingship before taking over the larger nation. Therefore, the decision to split Kent off may have been seen as a sign that Ethelwulf had wanted to end this tradition and establish Kent as a wholly independent kingdom. However, it may simply have been done for convenience sake for the duration of his visit, as Æthelbald did not have any heirs of his own at this time. Ethelwulf could also have theoretically undone the decision once he had returned to the throne of Wessex. However, this would never come to pass. It is unclear whether or not Æthelbald and Ethelbert always planned to betray their father, but events soon overtook them that made a rebellion all but inevitable. After spending a year in Rome, Ethelwulf travelled to Francia, where the king of the Franks, Charles the Bold, unexpectedly offered Ethelwulf a new bride, his own daughter, the Frankish princess Judith. The pair were married shortly afterwards, where Judith was anointed with holy oils before being crowned and finally proclaimed queen. Everything about this marriage proved to be controversial in Wessex. The idea of a woman being anointed and crowned queen appalled the nobility of Wessex, who believed that the wife of a king should not, under any circumstances, be seated upon a throne or crowned. In Anglo-Saxon culture, a woman's responsibility was to produce children and oversee the household. The idea of a woman openly wielding power, even only symbolically, was completely unpalatable. However, Æthelbald and Ethelbert had a completely different concern. Judith was the child of a Frankish king, and would presumably go on to become the eldest sister of the future king of the Franks. If she had any children with Ethelwulf, then they would presumably have the backing of the Franks in any future succession crisis. The only way to prevent this would be to seize permanent control of Wessex before their father could return. Soon the two brothers began scheming with a number of their confidants. However, the plot didn't gather much momentum until Æthelstan and Æthelwulf joined them. Æthelstan was the Bishop of Shelbourne, and Æthelwulf was a powerful nobleman from Somerset, and critically, both had previously been two of Æthelwulf's advisors. Their support would significantly legitimise Æthelbald and Ethelbert's plans. How exactly they intended to go about overthrowing their father remains a mystery. Whether they were considering raising an army to depose Ethelwulf, or instead having him assassinated upon his return, will forever be a matter of conjecture, for before their plans were ready, their plot was revealed to Ethelwulf, as he finally prepared to make the journey home. Ethelwulf did initially consider fighting them for the throne, however he ultimately decided against it. It is unknown exactly how much support Æthelbald and Ethelbert had at this time. If Æthelwulf and Æthelstan were the only powerful supporters, then the rebellion probably could have been crushed relatively quickly. But if there were other noble backers to the plot, then a war might become more drawn out and harder to win. Ethelwulf's decision to avoid a fight may have been due to his fear of defeat, or his desire to avoid bloodshed in his lands. Ultimately, Ethelwulf would make his sons an offer where he would divide Wessex in half, with Æthelbald ruling the west and himself ruling the east. There is actually some controversy surrounding this regarding what was done with Kent. Most historical documents state that Ethelwulf ruled over the lands in the east, which, some have argued, means that he took back full control of Kent again from Ethelbert. The argument in favour of this is that while Æthelbald is usually framed by sources as a wicked usurper, Ethelbert is generally characterised much more favourably, despite supposedly being just as supportive of the planned rebellion. The argument against this is that Ethelbert would go on to serve as King of Kent during the reign of his brother, and there is no evidence that he was ever stood down. It would also be highly unusual for someone in Ethelbert's position to simply surrender his throne, unless he strongly believed that his father could take it by force from him in the future. Regardless, Ethelwulf would return to the eastern half of Wessex, where he would reign with Judith by his side, while Æthelbald at least ruled in the west. This arrangement, however, would not last long, as Æthelwulf would die less than 3 years later, leaving his half of the kingdom open for Æthelbald to retake control of again. At this time, Ethelbert is again referred to as the King of Kent, which demonstrates that if he had indeed left the throne for his father, he was quietly reinstated once more after his death. Shortly after re-establishing his control over the whole of Wessex, Æthelbald would make the surprising decision to marry his father's young widow, Judith, who at this point would have been no more than 16 years old. While later sources would describe the match as an act against God and Christian dignity, there is no evidence to suggest that there was any real resistance at the time, although the clergy would undoubtedly have disapproved. The two brothers reigned side by side in their neighbouring kingdoms seemingly without incident. Coins that were minted of Ethelbert during his kingship of Kent do not acknowledge Æthelbald in any way, which strongly suggests that Kent was no longer a sub-kingdom of Wessex, but was now an entirely separate political entity. Æthelbald died in 860, probably sometime in July. It is unknown what age he was at the time of his passing, only that he died 2.5 years after his father. The manner of his death is also unknown. A handful of sources suggest that he may have been assassinated, but these were written hundreds of years after his death, and may have mistaken him for another King Æthelbald, who had reigned as King of Mercia and had been assassinated 100 years before. Æthelbald's death would pave the way for Ethelbert to take the throne, which he would do so shortly afterwards. Judith, meanwhile, now at most only 18 and already twice widowed, would quietly return to Francia. Following Ethelbert's ascension to the throne of Wessex, some interest would have been sparked as to the new king's plans for Kent. His younger brother Ethelred would have likely still been too young to take the Kentish throne, and there may have been some speculation that Æthelbert would offer the sub-kingdom to a trusted nobleman to hold until Ethelred was prepared to take over. However, Æthelbert would dispel these concerns by instead deciding to dissolve the kingdom of Kent entirely and fully incorporate the land into Wessex itself. Shortly after taking the throne, Æthelbert's kingdom would suffer a sizable Viking attack in Hampshire. This was eventually repulsed, although Æthelbert himself is not mentioned as participating in the battle. Yet, despite these early Viking incursions, Æthelbert's reign would be one of peace and relative calm, and he would build a reputation as a good and honourable king. He would also work to maintain a strong relationship with his younger brothers, and they would sign on as witnesses to a number of his charters. It is also likely due to Æthelbert's deliberate efforts that Wessex began to move away from his father's attempts to preserve Latin as the official language of the kingdom and began switching the language of charters to Old English, like many of the neighbouring kingdoms. Æthelbert would also move to increase the freedoms of Shelbourne Church in honour of the fact that his father Ethelwulf and his brother Æthelbald had been buried there. A following Viking incursion would occur in 864 when a Danish army landed in Thanet and demanded a tribute if the people wished them not to pillage the countryside. The people of Thanet would agree, but the Vikings would break their oath and ravage the Kentish East before leaving. It is unknown if Æthelbert ever married, but what is known is that he never produced an heir. Late into the year of 865, sometime likely in mid-autumn, Æthelbert would also pass away from unknown causes. He had reigned for a total of just 5 years as King of Wessex. Much like his father and brother, Æthelbert would be buried at Shelbourne Church. His younger brother Ethelred, the fourth son of Ethelwulf, would subsequently take the throne. Æthelbald and Ethelbert would ultimately become two of the most overlooked monarchs in English history, their own reigns overshadowed by their younger brothers. Æthelbald would be recalled by the ancient sources as an arrogant, vain king who had led Wessex into 2.5 years of lawless rule. His rebellion against his father, as well as his marriage to Judith, is often seen as a demonstration of his sinful nature. Ethelbert would conversely be remembered as a good, loving king who had presided over a time of relative peace and would be remembered as the last English king to do so until the final Viking invasion in English history would be repulsed at Stamford Bridge, over 200 years later. Given that records of their reign are so scattered and mostly written many years later, it is impossible to determine whether or not these assessments are fair. However, one thing that cannot be denied is that during their own reigns both men were able to keep the peace in Wessex and ensure that the kingdom that Ethelred would inherit would be well positioned to continue the defence of the kingdom from further Viking raids. However, no one could have expected at the time of Ethelbert's death that Wessex was about to be shaken to its very foundation by a heathen army the likes of which England had never before seen.